Ja gut, herzlich willkommen zu Einblicke in die Digital Humanities. Das ist eine Ringvorlesung, die wir eigentlich planen, regelmäßig durchzuführen. Es geht darum, Ihnen möglichst viele, möglichst unterschiedliche Einblicke zu geben, welche Projekte aktuell am Laufen sind, einerseits in der Schweiz, aber auch darüber hinaus. Das ist eine Vorlesung, die am Institut für Geschichte angerechnet werden kann, bei der Germanistik und als freie Leistung. Wenn es Anrechnungsprobleme gibt, dann am besten wir das per Mail melden, dann können wir das aussortieren, aber das klappt sicher irgendwie. Der Vorlesungsraum hier ist ein bisschen gewöhnungsbedürftig, das ist mir klar, aber ich glaube, das ganze Semester wird etwas gewöhnungsbedürftig, da wir einen großen Teil der Leute auch auf Zoom dabei haben. Ich glaube, aktuell sind etwa 20 Leute auf Zoom dabei. Die möchte ich auch ganz herzlich begrüßen. Ich bitte alle auf Zoom, die selber nicht referieren, das Mikro und vor allem das Bild aufzuschalten. Ich glaube, wir hatten schon eine Meldung, dass es ein bisschen ruckelt. Falls so etwas ist, bitte unbedingt in den Chat schreiben. Christa, die den Chat betreut, kann dann darauf reagieren und wir können versuchen, das zu beheben. Bevor wir mit den heutigen Gästen starten, vielleicht ganz kurz eine Bemerkung zu den Leistungsnachweisen, wo Sie das anrechnen können, haben Sie dann selber hoffentlich bemerkt. Und der Leistungsnachweis, den ich einfordern möchte, das ist ein Versuch, ist, dass Sie gemeinsam in Teams Blogposts schreiben, und zwar auf einem Blog, der nennt sich Einblicke in die Humanities, also eines der Vorlesungstitel, die wir aber auch gerne veröffentlichen möchten. Das heißt, wir möchten einen öffentlichen Blog zusammentragen, in dem Sie eigene Perspektiven, in dem Sie eigene Einblicke in die einzelnen Themen zusammentragen. Damit von Anfang an klar ist, wann Sie eine Berichterstattung machen, wann Sie diesen Blogpost verfassen, gibt es ein Wiki auf Ilias. Da können Sie sich bereits eintragen. Da gibt es auch schon Leute, die sich für einzelne Themen eingetragen haben. Für heute hat sich, soweit ich gesehen habe, noch niemand eingetragen, aber es ist auch sehr sinnvoll. Super, du hast schon eingetragen. Das heißt, falls es schon Leute gibt, die wissen, dass sie über diese Sitzung Bericht erstatten möchten, dann tragen Sie sich da ein, dann können wir das dann ein bisschen organisieren. Die Idee ist, es gibt dann so einen Rücklauf, wo Sie dann auch Feedback auf Ihre Blogposts bekommen und wo wir dann praktisch langsam das Semester dann auch in einer schriftlichen Form, möglichst multimedial, also auch mit Bildern abhandeln können und so auch langfristig eigentlich so wie ein Tagebuch haben, was in dieser Vorlesung passiert ist, sodass wir das dann auch über die Veranstaltung hinaus sichern können. Falls da Fragen sind, genau, gleich eine Frage. Können wir gleich testen, ob man etwas hört auf Zoom?
Wie viele Leute
für die Vorlesung können 3 Leute sich eintragen und für den anschließenden Workshop, der jeweils von 4 bis 6 stattfindet, können jeweils nochmal 3 Leute zusammen oder einzeln einen Blogpost schreiben. Ich würde das kollaborative Schreiben eigentlich bevorzugen, weil es eine Form ist, die wir selbst nicht so häufig üben, aber ich möchte es auch Ihnen selbst überlassen. Das heißt, wenn Sie sagen, nein, ich schreibe lieber alleine für mich und gebe das dann so ab, dann ist das kein Problem. Aber wenn Sie sagen, doch, zu dritt können wir das mal austesten, dann bin ich total offen dafür. Eben bei Fragen per Mail gerne schreiben oder vielleicht auch direkt über den Zoom-Chat und dann können wir regelmäßig Updates, Mailings über IAS schicken, so dass Sie informiert sind und so dass Sie auch so ein bisschen sehen, wie das läuft. Gut, ich möchte aber nicht die Zeit den Referierenden wegnehmen und ich begrüße ganz herzlich on the screen. Eigentlich wäre es live vorgesehen gewesen, aber aus Corona-Gründen, mit Corona begründet, möchte ich sehr gern Martin Dusinberre und sein Team begrüßen. Martin is a professor for global history and he has a chair at the University of Zurich. He was Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at Heidelberg University. Before that, he was a lecturer at Newcastle University and he did a PhD in Oxford. He does, like that the title says, research on the global scale, but he's also specialist for Japan and Hawaii, and he has published a wide range of publications and monographs about this. With him is Danny McDonald. He's Australian, so basically also more or less British. He works at S3IT, and he's a linguist by training. He's partly responsible for the technical part of what they are going to present us, and he works together with Leyla Feiner, who works for the DLF, the Digitale Lehre und Forschung. That's a specialized center at the University of Zurich for the field history faculty. Okay, but I don't want to take away time from you. So, Martin, thanks for being here, even if it's only virtually, and I'll give you the floor.
Great. Many thanks, Tobias. This is just a quick check. Can you all hear me okay? Someone give a wave if you can hear me. Is that all right? I can't see anyone in the classroom, but yeah. All right. I'm assuming that everyone could hear me okay. Yeah, good. Someone's given a thumbs up. Thanks, Corinne. And let me just check that if I share my screen with you now, are you seeing that? Okay. Everyone got that? Yep. Yeah. Okay, super. Your screen, yeah. All right. So, first of all, many thanks for inviting me to talk today. I must apologize. As of this morning, we've had to go into isolation in my household, and that's why I can't be with you today. And one consequence of that is that it's possible we'll be interrupted by my two kids at some point, but I'll try and make sure that doesn't happen. But anyway, I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today, as are Danny and Leyla, but I hope we have a good session anyway. So what we're going to do, the way I thought I would structure this is talk sort of on my own for a bit, and then with Danny and Leyla for a few minutes as well, and then open it up for questions. That's the first half of it. And then, as I think Tobias told you, in the second half, we'll try and have a bit more of a hands-on workshop. And what I'd like to do in this first session is introduce you to a big digital history project, which I led at the University of Zurich from 2015 until earlier this summer. I want to try and explain a little bit about why we did this project and how we did it, and then open it up a little bit to how we feel about it now that it's done, at least that it's done in a sort of viable working form. So if you see now, you should be able to see my screen. You can see that this is the front page of the project, Lives in Transit, and the first sentence, Lives in Transit is an interactive text-based game which simulates the experience of researching and writing global history. Now, you might ask, and I certainly have asked myself a number of times over the last few years, how on earth we got to developing a computer game. It definitely wasn't the plan that I had 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when I put in for SNF funding in October 2015. The funding application was far more vague than what you see in front of you, but it had at its heart two issues. First, it was a project in which the digital was embedded more generally into three other, what we might call more traditional history projects, postdoc PhD projects, which were all to do with the transit of people, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, through steamships. I am trying in my free time to finish a book about steamships, but it's been delayed by various projects such as this. So that was one element, is we were interested in the theme of transit, and transit itself has become quite an important theme, not only in its more obvious forms, such as the history of migration that perhaps we're more familiar with, but also in intellectual history, for example, the ways in which knowledge isn't simply transferred from A to B, but the ways in which knowledge becomes co-produced in its movement from A to B. That sounds quite abstract, but maybe you can think of it in terms of colonial history or the history of medicine, history of science, that it was never, as European historiography once wanted us to believe, it was never the case that simply Europeans came and imposed on South Asia or East Asia their own ideas of medicine, and that the grateful brackets backward, close brackets, Asians simply accepted this medicine, that there was always some kind of negotiation that was going on in this process of knowledge, and that one could conceptualize that by talking about knowledge in transit too. So this idea of transit was both about people moving, about infrastructures and so on, but it was also about the ways in which ideas change. And I just want to sort of plant that thought with you because I'll come back to it. So that was one element that was behind our SNF grant. And the other was a sort of disquiet that I had about the practices and values of the discipline of history in a digital and in a digitized society. And let me say a little bit about that by just backing up and saying something about the practice of history itself. What is this discipline that we do? I mean, some of this may be unnecessary to you, but perhaps it's worth sort of revising it. That on the one hand, history is a discipline which analyzes how the world works in terms of human interactions in the past, right? But at a second level, it analyzes not only how those interactions worked, but also the stories that humans told about those interactions, about those events and so on, right? So you could say, if you wanted to be very simplistic about it, that at the one hand, it's about what happened. And then at a second level, it's about the stories that were told about what happened, about the narrative. And I think that this focus on narrative and on storytelling must be at the heart of a historian's work. I think that what we have to do as historians is bring a fundamental skepticism to the question of how other people have described the world. And that means that we have to investigate the kinds of sources that they use, the kinds of imagery that they use to tell stories about the past. We have to be critical of language, of the types of evidential logic that people use as they narrate the past. And we have to cross-reference. Now, if all of this begins to sound a little bit familiar, it's because actually others have very recently begun to join the game here. Here is the Facebook site in which Facebook explains how users should spot false news. And if we just scroll through some of these points, you'll see they're very similar to what I've just said about being skeptical of the headlines, about investigating the source, about considering the imagery, checking the evidence, contextualizing with other reports, trying to understand about the agendas behind why some people might put out intentionally false stories. In other words, what Facebook and many theorists call either media literacy or digital literacy, I simply call history. We've been doing this for decades, centuries as historians. And it's nice to see that Facebook has joined the game, as it were. So on the one hand, this should make us as historians feel pretty good about life, right? Actually, we have, in that pretty awful term, we have transferable skills here, right? The stuff that we're learning and teaching in the classroom is directly relevant to understanding the society that we are living in today, and not only to understanding society, but to critiquing the ways in which people narrate that society, which I think is almost more important, one might say, right? And yet, despite this obvious weight and power and relevance that history has, we still seem to be in a position as historians to demonstrate our relevance in a digital society. This takes itself in many forms. It comes partly in a view that some, but not all, university administrators and bureaucrats and IT specialists have about what it is that history can really bring to the table. That's sort of encapsulated in the type of argument that says, well, all historians really need to do is just digitize their stuff, and then, you know, that's what they can bring to these debates. That's one sort of approach to it. But I think we as historians are also partly culpable here, in the sense that we, I think, sometimes bow down rather too easily in the face of such arguments and just assume that, yeah, unless we can all code, we haven't really got anything to say in this digital age. And part of that is also a, I think, quite pernicious way of thinking about the world, in which qualitative work in a digital age is sometimes considered to be less important than quantitative work. And that really the ways in which we demonstrate our muscle as digital historians and digital humanities people is by big data, right? The bigger the better. And so there's a certain pressure that is being placed on us, and I think also we, as I say, bow down towards, to join the big data bandwagon. Again, one could say, well, historians have been doing this for years. I think that, well, I'll come back to that point in a minute, but perhaps we'll have a little look first at some of the examples of the ways in which the discipline of history seems to be caught up now in this big data bandwagon. One project that I imagine most of you are fairly familiar with, let me just try and do this a bit more skillfully, is the Venice Time Machine project. This is a huge project run partly out of Lausanne, which seems to have the aim of preserving for future generations sort of everything about Venice in the early modern period. That in itself is, of course, a very worthy aim, and particularly important in a place like Venice. But it seems to me part of the problem is that it only does one aspect of what I said the work of historians should be doing, which is it sort of is focused on what happened, on what things looked like. And the thing that I'm really much more interested in as a historian is in what they looked like to whom. It doesn't really make any difference to me whether we can say in the 16th century a building stood on this street and it looked like this. What's more interesting to me as a historian is to say there was a building on this street, it looked like this, in the eyes of a particular person who was standing on that street, but maybe it looked different in the eyes of someone else. And perhaps an example of this is to think about maybe one of the buildings at the University of Bern, or the Hauptgebäude at the University of Zurich. You know, what do you actually see when you see that building in your mind's eye? Or what do you see, to go a little bit more political, what do you see when you see the White House in your mind's eye? And it doesn't really help us to say, well, the White House is simply a building that, you know, dates from the 19th century. It has a neoclassical design and has nice lawns and so on. I mean, that doesn't tell us anything really as historians. What's interesting is to say, well, some people might say it's an example of the racist heart of America in the sense it was built by slaves. Others might see it as a kind of beacon of hope in an unstable time, and that as an image that has lasted for many years and of course been played on by Hollywood. In other words, the real interest that should come out of such big data projects is not just what did it look like, but what did it look like to whom? So that's one of the problems I have with this big data focus. Another example that we could look at is the Sechat project, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. It's it modestly calls itself a global history data bank, and basically aims to digitize as much of the world's data as it's possible to do in order to draw new hypotheses about societal change from the past. Again, I have no problem with that. Seems very interesting and useful, but it is kind of worrying when one scrolls down the list of the contributors here, how few historians actually are part of this project. In other words, we're lucky if we get a few consultants in there, but really the minute we start talking about data projects, we are ceding the intellectual ground to the data scientists. And yet the problem is that it's exactly these types of projects who get a lot of news coverage. Here we have a Guardian article from the end of last year, which focuses particularly on Sechat as a way of sort of seeing, as the headline says, how the past could save the future, as if somehow it can only be saved if we do it through big data. So there was a huge amount of disquiet that I was feeling back in 2015, having just arrived in Zurich, but I couldn't really articulate. I didn't have this conceptual language to articulate it in. I didn't have the kind of examples to articulate it in. But it was, my application to the SNF was very much focused on, would there be ways in which we could do digital history that didn't involve big data and that did put more emphasis on narrative? And it was a sort of open question. And to be totally honest, I was a bit surprised when the SNF gave us some money to explore this further. Now, I was by no means alone in this. In the field of art history, there's already a number of examples. This is a very recent one of trying to use digital technology to talk about art in different ways. This is an article from the New York Times, and when you start scrolling through it, you can see a text. And rather like Prezi, the image goes into much more detail as you connect or read different parts of the text. It's a kind of interactive historical essay. I mean, that's a very interesting narrative form, but it obviously helps that there's wonderful art to do it with. There is a project, a lot of this sort of rethinking of narrative has come out of mapping work, in particular using GIS and also various visualization skills in order to try and tell and narrate histories in new ways. This is one I'm familiar with because it has to do with the history of Japan, and David Ambrose was one of the early testers on our game, and his colleague Kate McDonald has also been following pretty closely what we've been doing. So here's another example. And then we get into something that's a bit more participants interactive. Again, this is from East Asian history, which I happen to know more about. This is the Amboina conspiracy trial of 1623, done by a colleague of mine at the Australian National University. Actually, I may have that wrong. He may be at Monash, and this is the sort of error that you're not allowed to make with Australian colleagues, Danny can correct me here. But anyway, this is a project to do with a trial in which, as you can see, the viewer of the website is a juror in the case, and therefore it's a bit more interactive than simply a sort of presentation of the historical pasts, which we just saw in the New York Times example or in the bodies and structures example. So as we began to talk through what this digital narrative project was that I had the money for, we were beginning to think that we should be trying to do something that is more interactive and less about a sort of simple presentation of some kind of historical arguments. And of course, one can go even further with this and go into the whole realm of historical gaming then. I mean, there's any number of examples to choose from here, but I'm particularly focusing on this, which is by James Coltrane at the University of Nebraska. He came and did a couple of workshops at the University of Zurich back in October last year, and he's been working on a historical game about the history of slavery in Virginia, I think it is. And he's not only the expert on the history, but he's also done all of the animation and music and so on for this game itself. I think it's not yet been launched, but it's coming out fairly soon. So this was the way in which we sort of moved from disquiet to something that was about displaying stuff in new forms to something that might be a bit more interactive, and then eventually into something that began to look like a game. It sounds like it was a logical process of sort of working out what we should be doing. It wasn't anything of the sort, as is the nature of these things. One of the elements of this was that I got the money from the SNF and then in a bit of a panic called up various friends and said, oh my God, what am I going to do? I have no idea. And one of them, as a joke, said, oh, well, maybe you should develop a game. And the consequence of, or the moral of this story is don't joke to your friends, because sometimes it can lead to projects that take over their lives and take over all of their time as well. Anyway, so you can see here how my sense of disquiet about narrative and digital forms began to develop towards a game. This would imply that I'm a gamer. I'm not. And so it was very important from quite early on in the project to bring in people to the team who were gamers and knew what they were talking about. And I'll come to that a little bit in a minute. Leyla in particular has worked and is interested in gaming as a sort of wider field. And she's been very invaluable about helping give us advice about how to develop our game, but also locating our game in this wider field of gaming. It might also imply that I'm familiar with the wider literature on gamification in the digital humanities, which I'm not terribly, because again, we have people who have really got a background in the digital humanities there, and Danny, who's on the screen somewhere, will talk about that briefly in a minute. My real sort of theoretical conversation, as it were, came out of a set of discussions that were going on among historians and have been going on for many decades about how much we should reveal about what it is that we actually do as historians. Now, one sort of classic articulation of that comes from an article by a very famous early modern historian called Keith Thomas, wonderful historian, who wrote in the London Review of Books, this is just one example, in 2010. And let me just quote this opening paragraph where he says, "It never helps historians to say too much about their working methods. For just as the conjurer's magic disappears if the audience knows how the trick is done, so the credibility of scholars can be sharply diminished if readers learn everything about how exactly their books came to be written. Only too often such revelations dispel the impression of fluent, confident omniscience Instead, they suggest that historians are concocted by error-prone human beings who patch together the results of incomplete research in order to construct an account whose rhetorical power will, they hope, compensate for gaps in the arguments and deficiencies in the evidence. And certainly, this view of history, which Thomas goes on to question to a certain extent in this article, but this view of what historians should be doing was very much in vogue even in the 1990s when I was a BA student at Oxford, and very clearly told by my tutors, don't use the first person singular in your essays. Nobody cares about you. So if you want to get all personal, like use one and, you know, make the case that stuff could be argued, or it could be stated, or it could be thought. All of this is passive, of course, beginning to sound quite like German academia or Japanese academia. Don't be too direct. And I began to feel very uncomfortable with this. And of course, I wasn't the only one. There's been this big debate within history for, as I say, several decades now about the extent to which we really should reveal ourselves. If you want to borrow the terminology from anthropology, the extent to which we should be reflexive in our work. And my taking up a position in global history at the University of Zurich in 2015 made me think about this with greater sort of urgency and intensity, because I think that actually is what global history should be. It should be about acknowledging the gaps, the inconsistencies, the lack of language skills that we have, the impossibility of really being able to imagine the other side of an encounter when we only have one set of sources to describe it and so on. And if we can't be open about that as scholars, then what's the point? We shouldn't pretend that somehow we have the last word on all of this. And I had experiences of this from my PhD, and I know all of my fellow PhD students did, and scholars all over the world still do, that the ways in which you collect your sources and the experience you have in the archives or in the field profoundly affects the type of knowledge that you're producing. And so in a PhD, this all gets cut out immediately. And I suppose one of the, as I began to think about a game in more detail, I thought, well, one of the things that we should be doing here is to have a game which is based on these outtakes. In other words, that we should be trying to help the players understand that the types of experiences they have when doing research and the ways in which they respond to those experiences are absolutely central to the production of the knowledge that they then say is a historical essay or a book or an article or whatever it is. So that's sort of some of the thinking behind it. Some of the practicality was I had in mind the Amazon cart function from very early on. And I thought it would be interesting if we had a game that wasn't about pretending you're a slave or pretending you're a migrant on a ship, but rather pretending you're a historian, that you're an MA student or a BA or a PhD student, you're doing advanced research, and what happens when this process occurs. And as it were, you are, in a very blunt way, collecting sources and putting them in a cart. As you do a process of research, you're gathering primary sources, you're gathering secondary sources, you're sort of plonking them in the cart, and then at a certain point you check out and you hope that you can write a decent essay. And I thought that was the sort of dynamic that should be behind what it was that we were wanting to develop in this game. So I won't say too much more now because you'll have a chance to play the game, but this began to be the sort of overall structure of the game, that the player is a trainee historian, that they are exposed to the process of gathering sources and of recording their ideas about those sources. And it's our record of that changing process that will help the students and the players better understand the processes that go into the writing of all history, but in this case, particularly global history. So our audience was BA and MA students, perhaps PhD students in particular. And it was partly also driven by the questions that I was getting in the classroom as I taught, namely, not what is global history, but rather how do we do it? Now, we're beginning to get into some of the structures of the game at this point, and I'll say a few more words on that, and then I'll bring in Danny and Leyla, and then we'll open it up for questions. One of the things that we tested very early when we had this idea that the transit, as it were, was not the transit of the migrants, but the transit of the player, was how do we record the changing of their ideas across time? That we would have a number of different triggers, exercises, as it were, that they would have to do in the game. And this was an ethic that was driven partly by Ad Fontes, which Tobias himself has been very involved in at the University of Zurich. In other words, there might be transcription exercises, right? And that in asking the players to do such exercises, we weren't just interested in the right or the wrong, but also in, you know, what happened when a player was asked to transcribe something, and how perhaps, you know, 20 or 30 minutes later in playtime, they might actually realize, well, wait, I didn't quite get that right, or the ways I've thought about this sentence that I've just transcribed have changed, right? That implies that transcription is a very important part of the game. It's not, it's actually quite a minor part of the game, but it gives you a sense of the types of exercises that we were interested in. And some, to give you a sense of some of the other tasks we have, there's a fake email server in the game. So as you're playing, you can be bombarded with emails, and some of the emails ask you to do various things. Perhaps you have to do a favor for your supervisor, or perhaps a friend asks you to do something. And that in responding to those emails, you're beginning to articulate your thoughts about something, and then all of your responses are saved. You know, we might say one of the things that's crucial to learn how to do as a BA, as a MA or PhD student, is to put in funding applications. So, you know, we needed to have some kind of fake funding situation in the game that would encourage the students to write under time pressure a quick summary of what their research is at the moment that they were doing the application. And we tested this, and one of the things that was, from my point of view, fun about the testing back in 2017, this was the sort of prototype testing or proof of concept testing, was one of the players complained how stressful he found it. And that did the job for me, because you know, academic life can be stressful. It's important to learn how to write to deadlines. And although he didn't much enjoy it, actually, I think that the emotion of feeling stressed about the situation would stay with him, and perhaps help him remember the games in ways that simply reading about a court case or about a map or whatever wouldn't provoke that emotional response. But all of this implied that we needed to have a functionality in the game to record what the players were doing as they were doing it, and to timestamp that, and then to give the players a chance to come back to that at the end of the game. And so we've named this a notebook. And in some ways, the notebook has taken over the function of the cart. As you play, you have a notebook, and you are saving stuff into your notebook, and you're jotting down ideas in your notebook. And as you write emails, for example, they're being saved to your notebook as well. So the notebook is the downloadable endpoint of the game, which will allow you to see how your thinking has changed across the playtime of the game, and therefore how your knowledge is being developed and changed. So here we are beginning to get back into this idea that knowledge changes in transit. So that's one example. It turned out that the notebook was extremely complicated to develop and had some implications for other things that we wanted to develop but couldn't develop in the end. And perhaps that's something we can talk about after the break, is, you know, the inevitable compromises that go into projects like these, especially publicly funded projects where you have a set budget and you simply can't go over budget. And I'll maybe just throw out a few other sort of big things that we were thinking about, and we can come back to them in the end. One of them obviously was this ethic of what the storyboard should look like, what the sort of arc of a playtime should look like. Obviously, it's a game, so it's meant to be, if possible, a little bit fun at times, but it's also in some ways a simulation for the real practice of writing history. So how are we going to get that? And one of the things that we layered into that, again, came out of our prototype testing, was that although it was cool and interesting not to have a sort of, pretend you're a slave type feel to the game, nevertheless, might there be any way in which, by being a historian, we could also get you to feel a little bit about what it might be to be, say, a migrant, right? And that implied that the types of exercises and challenges that you faced as a player might, some sort of abstract or I can't find the right word now, unconscious level, reflect the real experiences of the people who you are reading about in your sources. So the example we have in the Plantation Lives game, which is the sort of main part of the Lives in Transit at the moment, was to try and think about what it meant to work in a plantation. And one of the things that you read a lot about in the sources is this sort of time discipline, that the plantation was an early form of the industrial factory. And so one of the fields that we wanted to have was this constant sort of time pressure, do this within X number of minutes, like move on, be quicker. So that became part of the storyboarding as well, as we were thinking, all right, what are the sources and so on, and what are the exercises, and how do we think that the players' thinking might change, but also they should have this sort of pressure that might at some unconscious level reflect the historical reality. If we were doing a game about mental illnesses, then that would have a different feel. If we were doing a game about the environment, about environmental history, that would similarly have different issues. So that was one thing, is the sort of the ethic of the storyboard. Another thing that came up very early on is what's the sort of voice that the game should be written in. We didn't want to keep saying, hey, do this, do that. It should be intuitive. And yet, obviously, players at some level also need to be told stuff. So how do you balance that? And then I'm going to sort of wrap up this part of it by talking a little bit about the sort of infrastructure of the whole game, because that became very important in quite unanticipated ways in the last year of the project. And that very much coincided with Danny McDonald joining, and also Leyla Feiner joining the project, both in the summer of 2019. Danny, very early on, I mean, it always had been a plan that we had, that we would somehow use GitHub in the infrastructure of the game, but I hadn't really understood what that meant. I'd never used Git myself, and Danny was very keen to push that agenda, and he sold it on us in very convincing ways about what Git really was and what it could particularly bring to the game in terms of the process, not only of playing the game, but of writing the game being completely transparent in ways that perhaps someone like Keith Thomas wouldn't have been able to imagine 10 years ago. So we'll come back to Git. I think it's very important. And then again, with Leyla's urging, and it was something we already had in mind as well, we had this idea that it shouldn't eventually just be a platform for people like me to write storylines. That if possible, it should be also the case that anyone could add to the Lives in Transit sort of platform with a storyline, and that therefore this might be a way of teaching the writing of digital history through teaching students about the Git protocol, about version control, and so on. And it would also have this sort of democratization, as it were, of the ethic of the game, in the sense that it's not just sort of one professor in control of everything, but really it's a project that could be taken in multiple different directions. And we tried that a little bit in the spring semester. And I think it remains an open question where we are now with the game about where we could go. But ultimately, therefore, and now I really will shut up, the game has become, for me, something that isn't just about getting students to play history. It's also really become about a form of writing history, in which some of my, quite normal traditional academic work, which isn't terribly interesting and is maybe read by 5 people at most, could be translated into a form that could be playable by others by bringing in some of these outtakes from my own personal experience, and of course made up outtakes, and that in some ways writing a module for the game becomes a different way of publishing history, and that then takes this whole narrative to a higher level that we hadn't sort of anticipated when we first put in our application. So I'm going to stop talking now. Maybe just before we go into a question and answer session with an eye on the time, I could hand over just to Danny briefly to say a little bit. Danny has a PhD in digital humanities, and maybe you could say, Danny, a little bit about when you joined the game, what you felt Git could bring to it, why you pushed us to go in this direction, and what you think that what we've done in the last year brings to the game in ways that move it beyond some of these issues that I previously talked about. Okay, I'll hand over to Danny at this point.
Okay, I can jump in if people can see me. I don't know. Yes? I think so, and they can hear me. Oh, hello everybody. I can see a few people sitting in the room, which is nice. Hi, I'm Danny. As Martin said, I got involved in this project partway through. My background is in the humanities and social sciences, and I have a big focus on reproducible research and research methods and things like this. Also, I work in a part of University of Zurich where I work as a software developer, but also a consultant when different projects around the university need technical assistance, whether this is actually coding or designing or writing research proposals, grant applications. My part of the university can get involved, and we help out in all different projects, but this could be anywhere from, we do a lot of work with astrophysics and bioengineering, places like this. But my specific expertise is more in humanities and social sciences projects. And so when I came aboard on this one, really the goal was to bring the prototype system to launch, and also to facilitate technical infrastructure that was open source, so anybody could freely copy the source code of the game and make their own versions, host their own versions, make changes, or collaborate with us, make suggested changes, and we could bring them into our version of the software. And also to make sure that it was possible to write games in a similarly open source way. So just very quickly, I wanted to take you through our use of Git in this project. So if I share my screen and I show this window, I'm not sure how familiar people are in this room with the use of Git. Git is a software development tool that can be used to keep code, but also documents under version control, and to do something a little bit like what Microsoft Word provides in the form of track changes, so that it's possible to see who changed what and when, to switch between versions of things, to merge versions together, and that kind of functionality. For this project, Git is used really extensively. It's used for the front end of the game, which is the way that the game is displayed to the user in a web browser. Also the back end of the game, which is things that need to get stored in a database, where you are in the game, what your username is, these kinds of things. And then also, as I said before, games themselves are hosted in Git repositories. So here's an example of a Git repository. This is the front end of the game. You can see it just mimics like on a normal, this is just a folder that contains everything needed to show the front of the README that describes how you would install this software. You can click on any file and see inside it. This is JavaScript code that helps with the deployment process, for example. The different versions of the software are stored here. There's a branch called minor fixes, so something small was fixed here and then merged into the master version of the repository. This is me here, the user interrogator. If we were to click, we can see a small change that I've made. So everything is, compared to Microsoft Word, much more comprehensively tracked. You can see every little change I've made. This has been removed. Oh, this line has been changed to add no overlap for slight visual improvement. So using Git, you can go through and see everything that was changed in the code and when. It's possible to accept and reject changes and that sort of thing. So here was the front end. I can switch to the back end, which you can see is set up in a very similar way, but this is coded in Java, which was a choice that the external developers on this project made. Then, rather than take you through the Java code, I can also show you a game repository. So the game that Martin was developing, the sort of flagship product, is the game Plantation Lives, which exists on the GitLab instance, which is hosted by the University of Zurich. The game is, to write games, it's important, that Martin doesn't need to be a graphics design, Photoshop professional. So because this is a text-based game, there needs to be a way to write text and have this be transformed by the software into something that can be displayed on the screen. So the game is broken into folders, which represent the chapters of the game. And if you go into one of these subfolders, you find different files in a format called JSON, which is a format that's kind of at the interface of what computers can easily read and what humans can easily read. So here you just see a little bit of content that produces a title that's used somewhere in the game, Plantation Lives, Chapter 1 of 5, and then various instructions for the computer on how this part of the game should be handled. Is this the end of a topic? No. Is the timer visible? No. If we go to a text component, you can start seeing the text that comprises what you see when you're playing the game. So the content in this part of the game, in any case you wish you could switch off from all these thoughts about work, etc., etc. So this is content that Martin's authored. And I might add, there's a significant amount of work that goes into this, because in total this game is comprised of over 1,000 files. I'm not sure how many it ended up being, perhaps 1,200 or so. But all of these are written by hand. They're validated using tools that we, computer tools that we wrote specifically for this project. So you've seen the text, and this, this text can be combined with multimedia content, which is stored in a resources directory. If we just click on the first one, we can see an image here which gets displayed at some point in the game. So the point is, Martin can work on his local machine and push content to this repository. then the software that runs the game, there's two versions of this. There's a production version of the software, and there's a test instance where as content is being developed, Martin can take a look and see how it's going. So what happens is every time content is pushed into this repository, the test version of the software will notice the changes, and it will try to import them into a version of the game that's private and not sort of publicly available online. Martin can look around and see that everything works as intended, and when things are working, we can update the production version of the software with the finished content of this Plantation Lives repository, and then the game goes live. All of this you'll see in a minute. I think the only other main point I wanted to mention about our use of Git is it provides a really nice way of doing what's called issue tracking. So in this repository that stores the backend, this is the issue tracker, which is a very common feature used in GitLab or GitHub projects. Here, users, game creators, game players could note problems they find in the software. For instance, a timer supersedes on another timer on a different page. Or we can see a problem like lingering input text in a text exercise. If we go to an issue that's been finished, like changes to the front page, we can see here when Martin noticed problems in some of the text on the front pages of the game, which you saw before. He makes a list of all of these issues. He assigns them, in this case, to me. And I can go through, make changes, which are all visible and can be tracked, verified as correct, and then eventually they can be moved into the master version of the repository. So this Git repository stores all the information we need to see who's done what. And yeah, so it provides a kind of workspace for collaborating on code projects more generally. And yeah, its extensive use in this project has been really, for me, one of the high points of working on this project, because it's provided a completely open and transparent system that that anybody can get involved with. Any of you in the room, if you're familiar with Git, if you find a problem in the software, you can submit a fix for it, and we could accept it and update the game accordingly. And that kind of transparency, I think, is critical to contemporary digital humanities research. Provides new ways of collaborating, which proved especially important to us during Corona times when we were in lockdown and we could have students participating using Git rather than in a classroom. So I think that's all I had to go through. It would seem like a good point to actually play the game a little bit or have a look at the interface.
Yeah, we can certainly replay the game. Thanks, Danny. Do you want to stop sharing your screen just for a minute? Yeah,
yes,
perfect.
sure.
I'll maybe bring in just for a few minutes, if I can, Leyla, just to say a few words about the project from her perspective. Partly as someone who's got, well, Leyla can explain a little bit about her intellectual academic background, which is, I think, a bit different to some of the students that we have in the Historische Seminar, and also the significance of her interest in gaming, and also this very important point about how we might bring students into the writing of the game, which we sort of wanted to try out with her and with some of her colleagues. Do you want to say a few words on that, Leyla? And then Tobias, if it's okay, we'll open it up to question and answer. Does that sound okay?
Perfect.
All right, Leyla, after you.
Okay, hi, I'm Leyla. I'm a BA student at the moment of history and computer science. That came about because I did an apprenticeship before I came to university as a mediamatics technician. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it is basically sort of like a hybrid thing between like design and informatics and all that stuff. And I've always, well, not always, since I was a teenager, I've had like an interest in gaming, and I've started making games as a hobby. So when I sort of came across this project, I was really intrigued to see how this would work from like a historian's perspective. And I was also, I thought it was really interesting also to see that this wasn't a project that was trying to emulate games as people might imagine games who aren't familiar with all the like niche sort of genres. So it wasn't trying to be like you walk around in a 3D environment and I don't know, kill enemies or whatever. So it was a text-based game, and it was a game where you take on a role of someone. And I'm also kind of more interested in that side of gaming that is a little bit more experimental, and also where most of the people who make these kinds of games are amateurs and not like big studios with huge budgets. Yeah, and I sort of joined this project to kind of sort of talk about my experience with games and to yeah, I don't know, what did I do? I don't know. I just sort of
I mean, one
I
of the
just
things
sort
that we
of
can
told you my opinion. I don't know.
yeah, no, that was good. I mean, and often you did actually give us little clips of, you know, when we were stuck with particular things, you would come and say, well, look at it, how it's done in this game, and that was invaluable for me. But I think also, again, this is something we can come back to, is as Danny mentioned, as I mentioned, in the spring during lockdown, we had already planned to do a whole MA colloquium, effectively, MA Übung, taught on GitLab, so without using OLAT or any of the other sort of University of Zurich teaching platforms. And Leyla was the tutor for that class, which in this case was a big amount of work because we had to sort of teach Git protocol to the MA students. And that was the sort of first attempt to see whether this platform and this protocol that we'd used for the game ourselves could be something that would be more transferable also to a sort of general history department seminar, and therefore begin to sort of teach some of the students some of the skills that they could use partly to make a game if they wanted to, but also just in other aspects of their research lives. So we can maybe come back to that later if you want, because we could talk a bit more about the repository for that. Do you want to add anything else, or shall I open it up for questions?
I don't know, maybe just like from a perspective of getting students into it, I think the good thing about sort of Lives in Transit is that the main game development skill that it requires is writing, and that's already something like history students learn. So it's a form of making a game that is hopefully accessible to people whose primary sort of, you know, skill or job or whatever includes writing, I guess. It's not primarily only writing, but yeah, and I think that's a very interesting and good approach for making games in this scenario.
Fantastic. So I think what I'll do, Tobias, if it's okay, I can't actually see where you are in the room at the moment, but maybe I'll open it up. You've got a sense now of some of the ideas behind the project more generally, some of the decisions that we took, some of the ways that we were working, where we are now. I think perhaps we should say, you know, I think all of us, as often is the case in these things, we did a proof of concept stage in the first year of the project, but actually now the project has sort of officially ended. I think we would all agree effectively we're at the end of a proof of concept stage. Like, it's really been a 3 or 4 year proof of concept to say this is a project that is a bit different in the digital humanities for the various reasons that we've outlined. Might it work? Might others use it, be able to develop or its ideas in different directions and so on? And that's very much an open question, but I'll maybe stop here and thank Danny and Leyla and you for all listening as well, and open it up to questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I don't know if you hear it, if you knock.
Yeah, sort of. You might have to just repeat questions, but I can hear it enough. Yeah.
Cool, great. I have I think we have plenty of time for questions. And also, if you're on Zoom, use the chat, and then you'll have the possibility to raise your questions. Does anybody want to start? That's really the hardest question. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Sort of, but yeah, it might be good, Tobias, if you could just repeat it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll go to repeat.
You come a bit closer to the, or you can come closer to the microphone if you've got it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do it. I can move around mine.
So do you hear me now?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is, if I understood you right, you targeted the game mainly for BA and MA students. And my question is, where do you see the value in teaching people through a game how to become a historian when they are already learning how to become a historian or social scientist or scientist of humanities? Wouldn't it be rather a good, or wouldn't there be rather more value in teaching people who have no idea what it means to be a historian through a game?
Yeah, thank you. I'll maybe just repeat that question for those who didn't hear it, just to say that the target audience seems to be BA, MA students who already have some kind of background in history. And, you know, perhaps this is a bit of a surprise because in some ways, wouldn't it be better to teach, people who have no idea about history, some of these things. And I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. The reason that we focused on this is, do you mind my asking what your background is, discipline-wise?
Historian.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, just to play devil's advocate here, if I were to say to you, what are the key methodologies of global history? I'm sure you could come up with a good response, but I bet, like, whatever you said, any number of people in the room or myself or anyone on Zoom could say, yeah, but you haven't thought about that, or, what are you going to do about the languages, or, actually in these days, what are you going to do about not being able to travel to the archives, right? And so I think the experience that I get from teaching in the classroom is that although students have a background in history, there's so many open questions here about what it is that we do, and how the type of history that I would write would be different from someone who is not in such a privileged university system as in Switzerland, would be different if I were not white, were not male, was not British, you name it, right? And that thinking through these questions of positionality and access and stuff is something that we do need a kind of leap of imagination to do. And I suppose that the game offers that to its players. And some of the stuff that you get in the game you might think is fairly basic. And some of it, I think, is challenging even to PhD students who are, fairly soon to graduate. I mean, certainly that's been our experience through testing. I think if we were to write it for people who had really no idea about history, it would be quite a different game, because we'd have to sort of explain, like, well, what is a primary source? What's a secondary source? Like, why is it important to go to the archives? Or what is an archive, right? And some of those questions, like what is an archive, are in the game implicitly. But I think it would be quite a different feel, and that the voice of the game would be more interventionist if we did it like that. And so that's why we're particularly sort of focusing on the target group that I know best, which is, students like Leyla and MA students, PhD students, and so on. I hope that answers the question. And Danny and Leyla, feel free to chip in on any of this if you want to add stuff. I mean, Leyla, actually, do you want to say that yourself? Do you want to add something to that, as you are part of our target audience in some ways?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe, like the game isn't just sort of a teaching tool; it's also a practicing tool, if that makes sense. It represents sort of a different way of teaching or learning as well. because it's not just, you read something, you read what is global history, and then you talk about it. You also get to sort of do it in a way that is safe and like not like in an actual thing you already get graded on and like you can already sort of mess it up. It is a sort of like constrained practicing space as well that we're trying to offer, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe you can like elaborate a bit more on that, how your testing turned out. So what was the reaction of the students using this tool? So did they have the feeling that they are more in command of working with source material, or how would you frame that? So do you have first experience, or yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, good. So the question is, can we talk a bit more about the testing process and, excuse me, what the impression was that the students have it. I'll hand over to Leyla because she was actually, her first introduction to the game was the second really big usability test that we did in the summer of 2019, which was also more or less when Danny joined the project. But before then, we did a big test of the prototype in 2017. Yeah, I'll maybe hand over to Leyla first, and then I can say my own perspective on where this came in. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. My first impression of it was really happy that it was a lot of fun to play. I don't know. That might be a little bit of a like weird priority to have, and you're all gonna like see if you also think it's fun. Maybe you don't find it's fun, but I was just really happy. It was an sort of, I don't know, a lot of sort of like teaching games are a little dreary and a little, like teachy. And I think that's kind of an important thing for this kind of project, that it's also just like fun to experience and fun to do. Yeah, I don't know. What else can we say about it? About like the testing?
I mean, I can chip in there. Like we had a lot of students who said they had no idea that being a professional historian involved all of this stuff all of the time, right? I mean, that you're, I think, sorry, the person who asked the question, are you a BA student or an MA student or a PhD student? BA, right. I mean, maybe it's not the case for you, but I think it's surprising still to me how many students kind of look at what we do as professional scholars and think, oh, well, it's easy for him, it's easy for her, like somehow the ideas come fully formed out of their head, it's written on the page, like they don't have any of the kind of anxieties and stresses that we have as students in like getting the first draft done, and obviously there's enough money for them to do it, so there's never an issue there, blah blah blah. I mean, which is just not true, right? I mean, we all have these insecurities in our writing, and they last all of our career, and we're always cutting corners. I could tell you any essay that I've published, I could tell you the ways in which it's problematic because I've run out of time, or because I ran out of money, or because I didn't have the right language, or because I actually hadn't thought it through properly, or whatever, right? And so trying to simulate that in a short period for a player of like, wow, when I'm trying to do research, like it's not just about sort of thinking through something and writing it, but it's also about the logistics of it. It's about how I deal with the, slightly pushy peer who kind of actually really wants to steal my project, or, the really annoying professor who keeps bashing me emails about this and that and kind of putting pressure on me in slightly snide ways. And, where am I going to get the money from? And, like if I'm lucky enough to get to some kind of archival trip, like how does that going to affect what I do? It depends, who I meet in the archives and stuff. And I mean, I would say play it to see whether you get that. But that sense of like all of this stuff is happening all the time, and at the same time is something a lot of the students said, well, I had no idea that scholarship was like that.
Yeah, because it is sort of the experience of a PhD student you're experiencing. So it is quite different from what it's like to be a BA student, for example. So Like you don't get to go to Hawaii for like a BA Seminararbeit, right? Which I think is also like a fairly interesting dimension to like see. And yeah, it's also not only about sort of the research aspect, but also about like sort of the emotional and social aspect of academia, I guess.
Other questions in the room? So I would have a question to Danny, for Danny, regarding the whole Git environment, not really a technical one, but rather like from a scholarly perspective. Do you think that it could make, using Git could make our work more like viewable, or also our methods more like understandable? That's like the first part. And the second part then would be, do you envision like some seminar papers being written directly on Git, maybe they being in a multimedia way or such a trajectory? So do you envision like University 2.0 is going to be run on infrastructure like Git or something like that?
Danny, do you want to turn on your mic?
Yes, sorry about that. So if I understood correctly, the first part of the question was if Git poses a bit of a challenge for people involved in the game making process.
No, it was rather more about like using Git.
I had a little trouble hearing the question.
So I'll try to stay closer to the mic. So do you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yeah.
So like from a scholarly perspective, using Git, could that be a way for like our work to be presented in a more like streamlined and more approachable way that you can like understand like the basics, what research has really been done, or would it be just like do it on a fancier way? So basically, what's the pros of using Git if we envision this for use in the humanities? So if it's not about developing a game or something, but rather like writing a seminar paper.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm very much a Git advocate in general, and I try to tell people that it's worth investing the time in learning this skill. But it is also important to remember that it might not be appropriate for doing absolutely everything. There is a learning curve to it, and not everybody will take to it very quickly. And yeah, it's better for some things than for others. So it originated as a tool for tracking changes in code, and that is really what it's best for, because with code, if there is a single bracket out of place, then the whole code might break. So it's kind of a higher stakes environment than just Microsoft Word tracking changes when you're collaborating on a document. But that said, it offers much greater potential as a tool for version control more generally. So rather than collaborating on, say, a journal article on Git, I'd say like a great use for humanities and social science researchers would be if they have a data set that is messy, like if you have some unclean data where things aren't formatted correctly, and a team of people is involved in cleaning this data up, making fixes and getting it to a publication standard, then Git would be a place where you can track all of those changes really effectively and assign jobs to people, and people can contribute their own kind of discrete parts. Personally, I stored my PhD thesis inside Git, and I found that really helpful. But that was just as a single researcher, and with a computer literate thesis advisor, I could just send my repository to my supervisor, and he could look at it directly and make comments and suggestions in Git. So what we find in our where I work with a lot of programmers is Git and GitLab and GitHub can be used for a wide variety of tasks, many of which would be beneficial in the humanities and social sciences as well. But it's not necessarily for every single task, especially just writing, especially if you're more comfortable using Microsoft Word. Git doesn't store Microsoft Word documents very well. It's much better at storing plain text and comma-separated spreadsheets, these kinds of things. It's not designed to work as well with that Microsoft suite of products. So if for example, you use LaTeX to write your thesis, then Git is a much more obvious choice than using a tool like Dropbox would be. But the final thing I would say from my experience here is if you ever found yourself in a situation as a researcher where you were emailing versions of documents back and forward, or if you keep saving documents over and over again and you have like article 1.1.2 master final, and that's the name of the file, then this is the kind of problem that Git is supposed to solve. If you're trying to deal with versioning and all you have is the file name or adding the date to the file name or something like this, this is exactly where you would use a version control tool like Git to come in and aid in the process of versioning.
Cool, thanks.
There's a question on Zoom, which I'll answer in a minute, but just at this point, Danny, do you want to just maybe just show on the screen the Digitite repository, which is one that was, to answer your question, Tobias, when we taught this class in the spring, we then had the students doing their projects by making Git repositories. And that's still a sort of work in process. Danny can maybe show that, or I can show my screen.
Yeah, I can do this. Can it be seen? Can be seen okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we carried out this MA Übung, History in a Digitized World, Digitite for short, where all of the class materials. So at University of Zurich, we use OLAT traditionally. I don't know if that's the same as what's being used in Bern. As a learning management platform, but we instead switched from that university-wide platform to using GitLab. And in short, we found this to be a really successful project. We used the issue tracking feature that I demonstrated before to assign work, to initiate discussions. All the students in the class could log in and give feedback on what we were going to teach in the next week, or provide feedback on how their assignment went. Yeah, we could use this as an announcement, frequently asked questions platform. And then we could also use the wiki feature of GitLab to allow students to do some basic publication. We ask students to create short biographies, add information about how to use Git in more depth and how Git works under the surface. Basically, as we went along in this class teaching digitized history, using this as the platform for storing basically everything, for communicating with the class. Every student managed to pick up at least basic familiarity with Git and gave us very positive feedback on the use of this as a learning management platform in comparison to Blackboard or OLAT or whatever the alternatives are. Martin, maybe you've got some experiences with this one as well that you'd like to share?
No, I mean, this just to say, you can, all of you check this out. It's totally, this repository is open, isn't it, Danny?
Yes, I think so.
Right, so you could also look at the individual students' profiles, and they've all made, or most of them have made repositories there, and they're working on projects. Or you see here, there's projects, yeah. So this will then take you to, this is, for example, Henrik, who actually tested the game by writing a storyline in the game as part of his assignment for this class. So you can just explore this on your own, and Tobias, you could get a sense of how we've used this in class. And also, I mean, one of our ideas was that if we have these wiki pages and so on, that, you know, someone coming after us doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. That you know, people could fork this if they wanted, and you know, develop their own repositories. And I think the bigger ambition here would be to ask, in something like a, I don't know if you have at Bern, like something like a Schreibübung class, but the question would be whether we could put something like a Schreibübung class onto Git, rather than teaching it in terms of, you know, this week you're writing a review and next week you're writing an abstract and the week after you're writing an introduction and so on, that all of that could go onto a platform like Git, and that all of the comments and so on, debates could be hosted in a repository rather than being on all that. And that, of course, gives the students a sense also that they're creating a sort of digital portfolio which has an afterlife after they've left the University of Zurich in ways that an OLAT portfolio doesn't. Anyway, thanks, Danny. Sabina Kaiser has asked a question, which is, could the game also be interesting for a history tutorium to learn about working with archive material, how to search in catalogs of archives, etc., to learn about source criticism, or is it for personal enrichment? No, I think actually we see this as a teaching tool. So one of the sort of challenges for the next stage would be to say, the next person we need to teach are the teachers, who then could use the game in class. I always anticipated that you could, if you were teaching a class about source criticism, for example, or just a BA seminar on historiography, that you could set the students as a 1 week homework exercise, go and play this particular storyline in the game. It will take about 2 hours to play this particular storyline. And then on the basis of your downloadable notebook, bring it to class and we'll start a discussion about whatever the theme is that you've chosen. We do have a teacher functionality. If I share my screen with you in a minute, just see if I can do this. So, are you seeing the front page of Lives in Transit now?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So if I log in, we have a functionality here of supervise a group game. And what you can do then is add the email addresses of your classes, and you can set them, for example, a particular time to play a game with a link so that they can play it, you know, in a particular window, or they could even play it in class simultaneously together. And that you as the teacher would actually, in this particular format, with the students playing it through your link, you would be able to see their notebooks, so that you could get inside the thought process, as it were, of the students. And as a teacher, for me, I would find that particularly valuable, because, you know, I can't tell you the number of times I've spoken to a student, they've shown me their essay plan, they've talked about what they're interested in, and then 4 weeks later they've submitted their essay, and I've sort of thought, well, wait, this doesn't quite match what you said you were interested in, and if you really are interested in whatever it was, why haven't you done A or B or C? And I can't trace, as it were, where they might have taken not necessarily a wrong path, but a sort of an unusual path or a different path from what perhaps I would have taken. And one of the things in the game is you could begin to say, all right, well, early on, you've responded to this email by saying you're particularly interested in the history of Labour. And yet when you had the chance to look at a Labour-related source, you chose not to. Why was that? And this functionality in the game would therefore, I think, particularly benefit teachers who are trying to sort of help students think about the implications of the choices they're making for their academic output, as it were. So that's one functionality that we have. So I always imagine that the game would also have an offline afterlife, if that makes sense, that the students would play, but then on the basis of playing, that would be really the starting point of a discussion about, you know, what is a source, or what is global history, or what does it mean to go to the archives, or whatever it may be. The other sort of element of that is I was quite driven from early on by being in dialogue with an article by Laura Putman in the American Historical Review called The Transnational and the Text Searchable. That article is sort of trying to explore what it means for the act of writing history that so many sources are now digitized. And Putnam makes the case that, you know, the digitization of sources doesn't necessarily lead to better research. In fact, it can take our research into quite unusual directions and quite unintended directions. And the article sort of explores what are the implications of that. And one of the things that is important to me as a historian is a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in migration history isn't digitized in Japan, for example, for data protection reasons. And therefore, if we assume that sort of the work of history is all about more digitization, we're actually going to sort of create or contribute to the silencing of some voices from the past unintentionally. And so part of the sort of ethic of the game is to get the player to keep thinking, like, I could do this online, but should I really be going to the archives? Like, what might happen if I went to the archives? Is the archive simply some building in whatever city it is, or actually, you know, might the archive be a graveyard that I bumped into at some point, or could it be the landscape in some ways, or could it be sort of initiated by a discussion I had with someone? And these are questions that are perhaps more pertinent to what we might call an analog way of doing history, even in a digitized world. So these are questions at the heart of the game.